Welcome to the latest interview with Flamingo's apartmentalized video thought leadership series. So for this one, we have Kristen Magni, who I'm really excited to interview to talk about employee engagement, resident experience, diversity and inclusion, and a few other things. So Kristen is currently the managing director at hyrUP, which is a human capital innovation company. We'd love to hear a little bit more about that. So I'm not going to butcher exactly what you do, so I'll kind of let you give your intro, what you do, what you focus on,
Sure.
and then what hyrUP does.
Sure.
So welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, happy to speak with you and talk about this topic. I'm very passionate about it. I started the consulting practice for hyrUP in May of 2020. We're a boutique consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. Middle of the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So it's been interesting because there's been so many things happening that affect people during this time. So some people say I'm crazy for starting a business in the middle of transformational change in our world.
Was it actually in the middle of the pandemic, or was it like pre-pandemic?
It was right at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And
was it something you had already started thinking about, or was it something that was inspired by the pandemic itself?
No, it was something that I'd always wanted to do, and events made that a possibility at that time, and I decided to leave corporate America and start this practice. And originally, it was going to be centered around what we say human capital innovation. So creating environments in which people can thrive in their workplaces. And in my previous role, I had also led diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I knew that was going to be part of what I wanted to do. What I didn't know is that George Floyd was going to happen and that things would pivot and companies would be laser focused on things like diversity and inclusion. So some of the work I do is more in the people strategy space, traditional people strategy work. I do a lot of work around employee engagement, and that also feeds into the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, because part of the discovery process in working with an organization to understand how people are experiencing the organization is to collect feedback. And so it's imperative that every voice is heard around a variety of topics that affect their ability to have upward mobility and to perform at their best.
So how did your career progression kind of lead you to this? I know you were previously at Bozzuto and then at Grace Hill. So what has your career progression looked like, and how did it lead to hyrUP?
So I started out in hospitality operations. I was a communications major in college. I actually wanted to be an anchor woman on television. So this is a little serendipitous right now, I know, right?
Now you can practice it.
Right. Exactly. I'll see how this all works out. Yeah, maybe I'll be discovered after this. So, but there were no jobs for me to do that as a woman when I graduated college, and I took a different path, and I got into hospitality operations and spent some time there. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I've always been in real estate. I was actually building food courts in convenience stores, and I was setting up operations in airports for food service from the ground up.
Wow.
And I did that in Atlanta. I did that in Chicago, where I lived prior to being in the D.C. area. And then I just made a complete career change and somehow wound up getting into staffing, which led me into talent acquisition and then led me into the corporate HR space. So I was at CoStar for about 6 years, and I led their talent acquisition function before I moved on to Bozzuto. And when I started at Bozzuto, the company had less than 1,000 employees, and when I left, they had over 2,500.
Oh, wow.
And so, again, creating an environment that enabled that organization to grow exponentially over, an 8 or 9 year period cannot be done by doing things the same way that everybody's always done them.
Yeah.
So I think part of that success has a lot to do with the fact that we were always tearing things down and building them back up. We were always early adopters.
Yeah.
If anybody had a new product that helped to streamline the experience, we were always willing to test it.
Yeah.
And so we
what
built.
did some of those things look like at Pizzuto?
Well, on the talent acquisition or employer branding side of things, we were very early adopters of social media, using social media, using the voice of employees to help attract talent, and creating ambassadors within the organization to attract talent. So there were referral programs, but referral programs sometimes put you in a situation where you're fishing in the same sea.
Everyone else.
Right, exactly. And so we figured for every employee who is online and has a social presence, which most people who are millennials do and professionals do, then they have X number of professional contacts that are going to trust their opinion about where is a great place to work. So early on, we started building our employer brand online. We quickly pivoted to video when some of the traditional posts were being done by everybody else.
It's interesting because how long ago was that?
So I started at Pizzuto in 2011 and left in 2020. And so I want to say we started doing that. Geez, it's hard to track the time, but probably 5-6 years ago.
Oh wow! So the reason why that's so interesting is because, like, right now, or at least from 2019 to now, it's been when everyone has been talking about video. Like, video is the next big thing on social media. It's what stops the scroll that everyone does.
Right.
So really cool that 6 years before Pizzuto was already doing it, 5 years before you guys had already picked into it. And I also love that element of really utilizing employees and their voices to kind of expand the message about the company and the brand, which is what a lot of companies are now starting to do. A lot of tech companies especially are figuring out, like, hey, we have all these employees, why not use them to really be a loudspeaker about our brand?
Right.
To build that.
It's free advertising.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
especially if they love working there.
In my time at Pizzuto, I cut our advertising budget for recruitment marketing and employer branding by 60% over the course of the years, because we simply didn't need to buy job slots or buy a presence, because we had already over time built that presence. And it's funny when I remember looking back at some of the first videos that we ever shot. We did an intern video. We did an employee video where I did the voiceover, and the script for that was actually
So you were
created.
really always meant to be on television.
I know. The script for that was created in a ride-along that I did early on with Tom Pizzuto, and just us talking. And then I wrote the script for the employee video that we did. But those videos were like 6-8 minutes long. So you talk about change. Nobody watches a 6 or 8 minute video anymore. So over the years, we went from doing.
People watch this one.
Well, I still think they're good videos. But you look at where we ended up in some of the videos we used maybe in the last 1 to 2 years. We went from doing 66-minute videos to 45-second videos, and allowing an employee to tell their story and just using sound bites. And those were just as effective. And so we did a lot of that. We were early testers of machine learning and AI in the sourcing process. We were very early in the grand scheme of what happens in property management to be thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, how do you engage a diverse ecosystem of people to talk about the brand, and to talk about feeling a sense of belonging, and to talk about success that they've experienced. So
let's take a step back. So when you speak on diversity and inclusion, can you explain for those that just don't know what that means? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, it's complicated, and I don't know where along the line somebody decided to combine all those words, because they mean different things. They mean very different things. So the way I like to look at it, because I think this is easy for somebody who's just thinking about what does all this mean, is diversity is the what's. It's multiple identities in the workplace. A lot of times when you ask somebody, what does diversity mean, they're going to tell you about the way somebody looks. When you ask somebody what they think of when they think of diversity, they're going to talk about the way someone looks. But there's many dimensions of diversity, some of which are fixed. So they're parts of our identity that make up our personality or our belief systems or value systems. Some of which are fixed, like race or age. Some of which evolve over time, like our religious beliefs or our professional experience or our body language, So it's much bigger than just the way people look, and what you really want in the workplace is diversity of thought, and that can't really be achieved with homogeneity. So having extreme diversity, being multiple identities represented in the workplace, is the what's. But that doesn't really matter without equity and inclusion. And that is your ecosystem. So if you think of nature, because we're a product of nature. We think we're better than all of that, but we're really a product of nature. If you think about a rainforest and how delicate of a balance a rainforest needs in order for all the creatures in the rainforest to survive. And not just to survive, but to thrive and to reproduce. Conceptually, it's the same thing when you think about people ecosystems. So inclusion is all voices are heard. People feel a sense of belonging. It's an environment that is going to be welcoming and accepting and embracing and encouraging all of those multiple identities. Equity is about infrastructure and systems, people having access, the ability to participate, a level playing field in order to thrive in the organization. So a lot of the work I do is helping organizations, working with organizations on that ecosystem. Then we can think about how do we make the workforce as diverse as we possibly can. But you have to have an inclusive culture, and you have to have systems, processes, practices, and policies that are unbiased. And in order to remove bias from systems and programs that have been created by a dominant group, you have to redress, you have to reckon with your own personal bias. So there's individual and interpersonal work that has to happen before that can be tackled from a systemic standpoint.
So you made a lot of really interesting points. Like one being the differences between just like diversity and the one on like actual inclusion. I read a while ago a quote that said diversity is like being invited to the party, and then inclusion is being asked to come on the dance floor. So from a very like practical perspective, can you give examples of how a company can actually go about implementing inclusion? So what kind of policies need to be implemented? How do processes need to be updated? What types of training needs to be done across the board?
So it's interesting when you say what sort of policy should be implemented, what sort of training should be done. That's very tactical. It's a good place to start. But a policy often winds up being punitive. And so, like, take fair housing as an example. Fair housing is a law.
Yeah.
Okay? Fair housing is in place, that law, to prevent discrimination. But discrimination is a lagging indicator.
Yeah.
Okay? And just because you have a law in place, A, doesn't mean people are going to follow it. And B, it doesn't change the way people think.
Yeah.
So you actually have to change the way people think. Now, I can't change the way you think necessarily. People don't change unless their desire to change is greater than their desire to stay the same.
Yeah.
But what I can do is I can demonstrate through my own behavior the way that I want other people to receive me and what I'm willing to accept in terms of the relationship that I'm going to have with another person. So we have to be careful with policies because we want the work to be what we call restorative, not retributive, which means it's punitive. Now you can look at policies for bias.
Yeah.
You can look at policies for racism. But racism is very overt, and so there's not. If racism is there, it's going to be obvious.
Yeah, that's what you can see. But what happens to everything?
Yeah, I mean, when we look back in history and you look at some of the things that have happened in our history, it's obvious, right? There's a fountain for white people. There's a fountain for black people. That's racism.
Yeah.
You can see it. Programs that have been developed over time, like the original public housing programs.
Yeah.
It was a great program that came out of the Great Depression. It was part of the New Deal. But housing for white people was separate from housing for black. That's racism. We can see that. Bias is biological. People create systems, people create technology, people create programs, and depending on who the people are that are making those decisions, that's how you wind up with bias in your technology, bias in your programs, bias in your practices. So, when it comes to creating an inclusive culture, you have to start by bringing people together in a safe space where they can build healthy, inclusive relationships, where they can have, when we're teaching, so we do quite a bit of educational programming in this space. And the framework we use, it's going to sound simple. It's mirrors, windows, and doors.
What is that exactly?
So mirrors, just like it sounds, is seeing reflections of myself in my environment that are affirming and help me feel valued. So I want to see people that look like me advancing in the company. I want to see people that look like me invited to the meeting, right? I want to see people that look like me being asked for their opinion. Those are mirrors, affirming reflections of myself. Windows are opportunities for me to see the world through a different perspective. That would be us having a conversation and you sharing your life experiences with me, because I grew up in Pennsylvania, you're from Baltimore. So we have different life experiences, and that's going to help us connect. But before we can do that, I also have to see you as a human. I have to have unconditional acceptance of your humanity, and then open myself up to respecting the fact that, making space for the fact that your lived experience is different. We don't have to walk away from this meeting changing our lives, the way we live, or even agreeing with each other. But we need to make space for that. So it's a process with people, because all of a sudden when they hear diversity training, they think of something that's punitive, right? Not something that really brings people together in a way that helps them to understand, wow, I didn't know that stuff happened. I didn't know people experienced that. I didn't know you needed to talk to your kids about those things. So the other piece of it is dealing again with bias, which has a lot to do with it. Actually helping people to understand, because bias is biological.
Yeah.
And we learn to be biased as soon as we come into this world, you know. And we start to make associations about people and things very early on in our life. But the great thing that's about bias is that it's learned, and so it can be unlearned. And bias is really the danger, not more than racism, in systems and structures, because we don't see it, you know. So we have to we have to unlearn those biases, and what we actually need to learn is a bias for inclusion. We have to teach ourselves how to do that, and it's thinking differently, because our brain uses two thinking systems. The one that's always on and is 90% of our brain activity is our subconscious. So when we meet someone new, we're relying on memory, on experience, on things that have been learned, versus activating that 10% of our brain that's capable of conscious thought and saying, well, how can I challenge my first impression? If there's some reason why I fear you, then what experience have I personally had to make me feel like I need to be scared of you? You know, so that's a very intentional process that happens over time. And so, you know, a training program or putting a few policies in place is not going to cut it. No.
So for companies that are doing this really well, like what are they doing differently?
So it's really interesting. The things I did at Bozzuto, and Bozzuto is known for their DEI work. For Bozzuto, it is and it was very much about company culture. Company culture has always been the thing that keeps, you know, the Bozzutos up at night.
Is that you hear that a lot, where it is part of the culture, it is something to really focus on. But I'm a very practical person, so I'm like, from a practical perspective, like how was Bozzuto able to create that? I know you touched on it a little bit, but if I'm an owner or CEO or VP listening to this, like, where do I start? How do I get going? I mean, I could hire up.
You absolutely could. I'll give you my card when we're done. It's different for every single company. So one of the great things that Bozzuto had going for them was a great foundation, a great founder's story. You know, Tom Bozzuto is the son of Italian immigrants. He had experienced in his younger days, when Italians were looked at much differently, a lot of racism. And, you know, he was always very progressive in his thinking and always wanted it to feel like family. Wanted it to feel like, you know, people could come into the organization, make a difference, and if you were a nice person and you worked hard and you did the right thing, always chose doing the right thing, then there was a home for you there. And so that founder's thinking, that founder's story has always underpinned the culture there. So it's nothing is easy. What I'm going to say, it's easier to build on that foundation that they worked so hard to protect. Even as the company grew, working to protect that was always at the center of their DNA. That's not the case for every organization. Companies change ownership. They're publicly traded. They have other, you know, stakeholders that have an impact on how they make decisions, and they're all starting from different places. So when you say, well, how does a company get started? There's a discovery process that needs to happen. There's some things that are relatively prescriptive, right? We're going to look at your data. We're going to look at,
And by data, you look at the makeup of the company, you look at
the diversity. Yeah, we look at the diversity of the existing workforce. But not just that, because that's kind of static. We want to see how people are moving around by gender and ethnicity, by generation, why they're coming and going, if that data is available, how people are moving up in the organization. So we can look at like application flow, from a certain point of saying people are qualified, and we can look at that by gender and ethnicity, and we can see, well, okay, how are people actually getting hired? What percentage of people are actually getting hired? And, a lot of times what we see, especially right now, is that there's tremendous diversity at the lowest levels in the organization, like your leasing professionals. Maintenance is almost entirely made up of men and, African American, Black, Latino. But for me, if your workforce is stratified, a lot of times there's a lot of diversity in property management. But it's like, we talk about Chicago. Chicago's very ethnically segregated, right? It's stratified in sort of the same way. So if all your women are on the office side of the building and all your men are on the maintenance side of the workforce, and all your underrepresented populations are in maintenance, and your folks that are going to move into leadership roles because they're responsible for P&L, so those people that have P&L responsibility are going to be the ones to move up into senior level positions. If they're all one type of person, that's really not diversity. It is, but it's segregated. So you need diversity at every level of the organization, unstratified. So we look at all of that. We look at how to make that happen. We look at the geographic locations that the company is operating in. So, in Boston, it's very difficult to hire diverse candidates because of the population of people that's there compared to, say, Atlanta. So if I'm operating in a majority location, I should have no issue having my workforce be representative of the communities that we serve. So we look at all that data, and that's kind of how we get a lay of the land.
So it's unfortunate that in a lot of situations, business decisions are made based on the bottom line. So from a bottom line perspective, what is the economic justification for diversity? I hate asking that question, but if I'm an owner, like, what is the ROI of diversity? Diversity of thought, diversity of representation, and all of that.
Well, if research has found that companies that have more diversity, that are diverse at every level of the organization, have an easier time attracting talent and less turnover. So first of all, if you look at the cost of people per square foot of your real estate, you will find that your people have the highest amount of overhead. There's the highest burden as it relates to people. You can take anything else that you invest in, your technology, your sustainability programs, your finance and accounting programs, and you can calculate that out by square foot of real estate, and every time, guaranteed, you will find that people cost you the most. So turnover can cost, 2 times someone's salary. When you think about the lost productivity, the lower levels of engagement, the loss of knowledge, the time it takes to fill the position, the cost of advertising to fill that position.
And so it's like the morale of seeing team members like leave.
Exactly. So turnover, all of that is very expensive. So it makes sense to invest in people, number one. Consumers particularly today, are very interested in organizations that are socially responsible. And under the umbrella of social responsibility is diversity and inclusion. When you look at the rental population, so the U.S. population is 18% Hispanic Latino, 14% African American and Black, I think 5% Asian. The numbers are smaller for Alaska Native and American Indian. 2 or more races. We can't get a reading on that because there's not everybody has a box for that. So we're ruled by boxes in this country. That's the makeup of the U.S. population. But the makeup of the U.S. rental population looks much different.
Really?
Yes.
In what sense?
Because the percentage of minority homeowners in this country is exponentially less. So if they don't own homes, then they're renting.
Interesting.
So there's a big difference between having your workforce be representative of the U.S. population and having your workforce be representative of the communities you serve. Totally different. It's actually inverted. So Black and African Americans have the highest percentage, or they're the highest percentage of renters in the country. And you might say, well, but you're not allowed to collect that information on someone's application, right? You're not. But the U.S. Census is collecting information on home ownership and where people live. So the data is out there. So that's very important.
That's a very surprising fact to me. Like, it's obvious now that you've mentioned it, but it's just not something that I would have thought about. I had all this time assumed that the populations for renters and the U.S. population overall would be very much the same.
No, they're not the same at all. They're not even close to the same. There's that to consider. Innovation is exponentially better with diversity. So what diversity does is if a company is leveraging the diversity they have in their organization, they're going to leverage that to make decisions about products and services. If I'm operating in South Florida and I don't understand what the Caribbean and Latino Hispanic consumer wants in their home where they live, I'm at a disadvantage. So how do I get that information? How do I get that information inexpensively? The best way to do that is to talk to employees who have similar ethnic backgrounds and have insight to understand culturally what the preferences are in a particular place.
So the last question, besides the disparity between the rental population in terms of diversity versus like the U.S. overall, like what other specific nuances are there in diversity and inclusion in the multifamily or real estate industry that's different than what you find in other industries?
So the real estate industry is still very, white male top heavy. And also Gen Y boomer generation. And so there's a disconnect between what's happening at the very highest levels of an organization and really what's happening on the front line. And so when people, like I said, don't see people who look like them at higher levels in the organization, then they think that they don't have an opportunity to get there. Which is really unfortunate. It's unfortunate, and in my discussions we do a lot of focus groups, we do a lot of surveying. I always do stakeholder interviews when I'm starting to work with a client. So we interview the senior executives to see how they're entering the conversation. And most of them are either terrified of it, or they just have never thought about it before, other than obviously it's all over the news, but really thinking about what is it like for someone who doesn't have the same privilege. You know, opportunities in this country have not just happened for some groups over others out of like coincidence. And it's not to say that people haven't worked hard for what they have, but you know, systemically, there have been advantages created for some in this country that haven't been present for others. And even though things are changing, we have 400 years of history that we haven't talked about. We haven't redressed it. We haven't. You just can't wake up one morning and say, today we're going to be diverse and everything's going to be equitable and we're going to be inclusive. You know, there's all this history that none of us ever learned in school. It's not in our history books. We like to tell success stories in this country that we have to contend with. So there's a great video that I like to show when I'm teaching. It's actually a commercial that was done by Canadian Tire. And it's a kid who they're all playing basketball. You know, it's a group of kids, maybe they're 8 or 9 years old. And there's a little boy who lives in a house in the neighborhood, and he's in a wheelchair. And he can't play basketball with everybody else. So one day, the little boy brings the basketball and sets it on the front stoop of the kid who's in the wheelchair. And the kid comes to the door, grabs the basketball, heads over to the basketball court. And lo and behold, these 10 or 11 kids have created apparatuses.
Oh, wow.
Whether it's buckets with wheels, carts, anything that they can have so that everybody can play. That's equity. Oftentimes people are confused about the difference between equity and equality. You have to have equity before you can have equality. And so what that commercial did was a few things. Number one, it shows that anyone can be an inclusive leader, not just a leader of people. It's behavioral. Number two, you can be really creative in this process. Think about new ways of doing things, new ideas that make people better. You ask what's the ROI? Well, when people are engaged, they work harder. They do better. They give their ideas. They give that extra discretionary effort. So there's a creativity. And then the other thing is, and this is what's so hard about this work, is that in order to create equity, oftentimes the dominant group has to give something up in the process.
Which is a challenge anywhere.
People don't like to give things up. They've worked hard for what they have. The dominant group has to give something up in order to create an environment, create the conditions for those who have not had the same opportunities, and in many cases, not by their own design, to perform at their best. And so that's what this commercial does. It shows that those who were not on wheels, they were really creative and they found a way to level the playing field so that everyone could play. And you know what? They all had a great time doing it. So in the end, they didn't give anything up because they were on the basketball court to have fun. And they still had fun. It just looked a little different.
Oh, awesome, Kristen. This was super helpful. So I really appreciate you being on.
Sure.
I'm sure the people listening in are going to learn a lot about how to really, one, drive employee engagement, make sure that everyone really feels inclusive in the workplace, and then hopefully it's given some of those leaders ideas like where to start.
Sure.
So thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.